Behind me is a chart detailing every known connection between the CIA and the art movement known as Abstract Expressionism, the single most famous American art movement. But why did I make this? There's a 99% chance everyone watching this video has seen at least one painting by Jackson Pollock, Willem de Kooning, or Mark Rothko. And on the topic of these artists, you have almost certainly heard a slew of conspiracy theories surrounding them. They were funded by the CIA, they were CIA agents, etc. Well, I'm here to tell you, this is correct. There was a conspiracy. The CIA ran the greatest cultural propaganda campaign in American history. They laundered millions through fake foundations, funded magazines across 6 continents, turned a ragtag group of New York painters into the defining art movement of the 20th century, and for 17 years, nobody knew. Everything you're about to learn in this video is based off of publicly available information. So if you have no idea what I'm talking about thus far, get ready for one of the greatest stories of the 20th century. This all starts with the founding of the Museum of Modern Art in New York City in 1929. The museum was conceived of by Abby Eldrick Rockefeller, the wife of John D. Rockefeller Jr., one of the heirs to his father's Standard Oil fortune. The museum would change locations for the next decade, until Rockefeller Jr. would donate the land for the museum's now permanent location. It is around this time in 1940 that Abby appoints their son, Nelson Rockefeller, to be the museum's president. During this period, Nelson, who was fluent in Spanish, had expressed concern to then President Roosevelt over Nazi influence in South America. Roosevelt would appoint him to head of the Office for Inter-American Affairs, the OIAA, an agency tasked with countering German and Italian propaganda in the region. With his experience as the head of the MoMA, Rockefeller gets the idea. Why not use American art as cultural propaganda in South America? You see, prior to World War II, America wasn't seen as the center of the art world, or artistically important at all. In fact, many European countries painted America as a cultural backwater. By showcasing the dynamism of America, Rockefeller would hope to change this. Rockefeller would use his position to tour 19 American art exhibitions around Latin America. This is the very first time in our story the government and art institutions would join forces, a precursor to what would become America's greatest cultural psyop. Nelson would step down from his position at the MoMA to focus on the OIAA full-time as World War II ramped up. He would be replaced by John Hay Whitney, a philanthropist and recipient of a $20 million trust fund at the age of 22. Under Whitney's leadership, MoMA announced in a press release the museum would serve as a weapon of national defense and would also serve as a vital force available to aid in welding solidarity in the hemisphere. Whitney would also have to break from his position during the height of World War II and take a position with the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, a precursor to the Central Intelligence Agency. Here he would be stationed in France, and it is on the front lines of the European theater he would meet Nelson Rockefeller's longtime friend, Allen Dulles, the man who would go on to be the first civilian director of the CIA. After the war ended, Rockefeller returned to his position as the president of the MoMA in 1946. Inspired by Rockefeller's initial Latin American exhibitions, the State Department would go on to fund the greatest piece of cultural diplomacy yet created by America. Curated by a man named J. Leroy Davidson, the State Department would fund a massive modern art exhibition titled Advancing American Art. The show would include 79 paintings from painters ranging from full abstract to social realism, and it would be split between a show in Eastern Europe and one in Latin America. This was, of course, all public knowledge. It was a state-funded endeavor with no attempt to hide the money. And because of this transparency, it was open for backlash. On February 18th, 1947, Look magazine would publish a hit piece titled, Your Money Bought These Paintings, which would showcase the modernist works in a negative light, many of which were created by immigrants with foreign-sounding names. This article would cause mass conservative backlash, with President Truman himself commenting on a painting by Yasuo Kuniyoshi, saying, "If that's art, then I'm a Hottentot." From the Look magazine article, the exhibition was promptly canceled, Davidson was fired, and all 79 paintings would be sold at auction as assets for a grand total of just under $6,000. With works by now famous artists like Georgia O'Keeffe selling for under $50, mostly to tiny universities and colleges around the country who could afford the small price. Those 79 paintings today are worth $14 million. And fun fact, if you watch and go to a tiny university or college in the US that for some reason has an extremely famous painting in its art collection, this is why. We now arrive at 1947, and the lesson is clear. Cultural propaganda works, but neither the public nor a conservative Congress would approve of such endeavors. If this is to be done correctly, it has to be done covertly. Luckily, the OSS just disbanded, and on September 18th, 1947, the Central Intelligence Agency would be created. Enter the man who would become the architect of the CIA's most ambitious endeavor, a former OSS officer named Thomas Brayden. Brayden would meet future CIA Director Allen Dulles during his time in the OSS in World War II. Dulles would recommend Brayden to Rockefeller as the MoMA's executive secretary, meaning the military and the MoMA are now formally linked. Brayden would work at the MoMA for 2 years, learning the inner workings of the museum, the curatorial process, and understanding the museum's international reach. Then, in 1950, he would leave the MoMA to formally join the CIA, as assistant to Allen Dulles, who was now the deputy director. This is just after Congress passed the Central Intelligence Agency Act in 1949, a law that gave the CIA broad authority for secrecy in operations and personnel management, all during a time when post-World War II Soviet propaganda was in full swing. After World War II, the Soviets had positioned themselves as a peaceful and culturally rich nation, opposing America as a threat to global harmony. They would fund global events to push this agenda, hosting summits like the World Congress of Intellectuals in Defense of Peace. One of these events, titled the Cultural and Scientific Conference for World Peace, would be held in New York's very own Waldorf Astoria Hotel in 1949. And much to the ire of the US, the event would attract many American thinkers, leftists, and pacifists, who would all attend to support a peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union. But this wasn't just about peace. In 1949, fascism had lost, and the world was cleanly divided between communism and capitalism, with many drawn to communism's promises of peace and equality. And the US had but one concern. You can be a radical, you can be a hippie, you can be a leftist, but you are never allowed to be a communist. Under this belief, a counter-protest of American anti-communists was held at the Waldorf Astoria during the Soviet summit. This counter-protest would set the precedent for something the US felt was desperately needed: a think tank of anti-communist intellectuals to copy the Soviet model and spread American ideas all around the world. But how would such a think tank be created? In June 1950, literally one day after North Korea invaded South Korea, a conference would take place in West Berlin. The conference would be attended by many famous intellectuals, many of whom had once been communist, but turned away from it in their later years. People like the philosopher Bertrand Russell, James Burnham, Tennessee Williams, and Carl Jaspers. The purpose of this conference would be to found an independent American anti-communist think tank and organize against the global Soviet propaganda campaign. A think tank known as the Congress for Cultural Freedom, the CCF. Unbeknownst to the attendees, and as I'm sure you're guessing by the nature of this video, this Congress would not be an independent endeavor. The entire thing was commissioned by the CIA, under the direction of a man named Michael Josselson, a CIA operative stationed in Berlin. The members of the CCF would not know Josselson's true identity until 17 years later. Until then, the US's top intelligentsia think they are operating on their own volition to spread American cultural ideas all over the world via the CCF. This brings us back to Thomas Brayden, working under CIA Deputy Director Allen Dulles, and with intimate knowledge of the MoMA's inner workings, Thomas Brayden spots a problem. The CIA is organized geographically: Far Eastern Division, Western European Division, and so on. But the Soviets aren't operating geographically. They're running international front organizations, labor unions, student groups, cultural associations that span multiple countries. The CIA has no coordinated response. So Brayden proposes a solution: create a new division, specifically to counter Soviet international propaganda, called the International Organizations Division, the IOD. Its mission will be to infiltrate, fund, and coordinate anti-communist organizations worldwide. Dulles approves of the idea, and Brayden becomes the first chief of the IOD. And the IOD's first task is to take control of the newly created Congress for Cultural Freedom. Brayden would control all of the CCF's funding, staffing, and major decisions. The budget, $900,000 a year. About $11 million in today's money. With the creation of the IOD by Thomas Brayden under Allen Dulles controlling the CCF via CIA agent Michael Josselson in a geopolitical environment where communism needed to be defeated at all costs, the final piece had fallen into place. With this apparatus in full swing, the time had finally come. It's time to AstroTurf an art movement.
Hey, sorry, I'm just bleeding out here. My shitty VPN company sold all my data. The Uzbek government decided I was a threat to their democracy, and send people to kill me. But that wouldn't have happened if I had Proton VPN. VPNs aren't a luxury anymore. They're essential for anybody who cares about their digital autonomy. And most VPN companies know this. They've turned privacy into a marketing gimmick while quietly logging everything you do. So let me tell you why Proton is the only VPN I would trust. They're headquartered in Switzerland, specifically to operate outside of the Five Eyes network. They've been independently audited the last 4 years, denying 100% of legal data requests. And their code is open source. So you're not just taking their word for it. You can check. They've even threatened to leave Switzerland rather than comply with new Swiss laws that would force them to log your data. The internet isn't what it was 10 years ago. ISPs are logging everything, the government is monitoring everything, and platforms are using your data to curate what you see, what you think, and what you're even allowed to know. A VPN isn't about unblocking region-locked content anymore. It's about maintaining sovereignty over your digital existence. Proton gets that, and they've never compromised on it. Right now, they're running an end-of-year deal. 75% off, 10 devices, 15,000 servers. If you already have a VPN, switch to Proton. And if you don't, get Proton before it's too late and you're ground into fertilizer. Proton.com/artchad, 75% off, link below.
So, who are the candidates to be part of the CIA's most ambitious cultural psyop? While modern art had been mostly a European project starting in the early 1900s, there hadn't yet been a distinctly American art movement to gain global recognition. This doesn't mean there wasn't a plethora of American art styles, but none of them had taken root yet. Chief among these are a ragtag group of artists working out of New York City, taking advantage of cheap converted warehouse studios in Manhattan. These artists would be pushing boundaries with abstract styles and paint-handling techniques never before seen, a style known as abstract expressionism. The major players in this movement start with Jackson Pollock, perhaps the most well-known American painter in history. The reasons why will become clear. Following him are artists like Willem de Kooning, Mark Rothko, Robert Motherwell, Franz Klein, Adolf Geitlib, Lee Krasner, Arshile Gorky, and Philip Guston. These artists not only share a common style, but also a common origin story. Almost all of these artists come from a poor immigrant background. De Kooning would stow away on a ship from Europe at the age of 22 to make his way to America. Rothko's family would flee Latvia to escape pogroms and rising anti-Semitism. And Jackson Pollock would be raised as one of 5 children to a single mother in California. These weren't the children of aristocrats trained from birth in classical styles. These were poor Americans trying to make something of themselves. And it's during the Great Depression in the 1930s, many of them would get their first break. Ironically enough, through a state-funded art program. The Federal Art Project was a New Deal program designed to support artists during the Great Depression. It would pay artists between $23 and $35 a week to paint murals, create furniture, and other pieces of public art. Notably, because this was a state program, it made no distinction between artists' styles or backgrounds, allowing painters and artists to develop avant-garde abstract styles with a social safety net. Pollock, de Kooning, Rothko, Krasner, Gorky, Klein, and Guston all got their start under the Federal Art Project, without which we would have never known their names. If there is a style to be the polar opposite of Soviet realism, it is abstract expressionism. Social realism is hallmarked by literal propaganda of workers smiling, working together, and representational portraits of Soviet leaders. In contrast, abstract expressionism was about freedom, emotion, spontaneity, and individual expression. And this all comes to rise during the 1940s in New York, a period of time when artists and thinkers were fleeing Europe in droves to escape Nazism, with artists like Salvador Dali and Piet Mondrian all leaving for America. Europe's infrastructure was in ruins. Paris, the former center of the art world, had been hollowed out both literally and artistically, and the art world no longer had a center in Europe. It's the 1950s. There is a cultural power vacuum, and abstract expressionism would be the perfect candidate to fill it. So let's cut back to the CCF. They've opened 35 offices across the world and have begun funding magazines, conferences, and art exhibitions. But they have one problem. They cannot repeat what happened in 1946 with the Advancing American Art Exhibition. If anybody found out anything funded by the CCF was tied to the CIA, it'd be over. It would be dismissed as propaganda by the Soviets, and would be accosted by a conservative Congress and American public. So, the CIA comes up with a plan, capitalizing on the 1949 Central Intelligence Agency Act, which allowed them to move money around off the books. The CIA developed the Triple Pass system. Here's how it works. 1. The CIA directly transfers money to a dummy foundation, a shell organization that exists only on paper, created by the CIA. 2. The dummy foundation makes grants to legitimate foundations, things like the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, etc. 3. The foundations mix their funds with CIA money and make grants to the intended recipient, completely erasing the CIA's fingerprint. Like dark money laundering. The chief dummy foundation for our story is one known as the Farfield Foundation, run by Julian Fleischmann Jr., heir to the Fleischmann yeast fortune. Yes, that yeast, that brand of yeast. When you're at the grocery store with your mom, and she buys it, and it looks like condoms, and you're like, Mom, what the fuck is that? She goes, it's yeast. You go, what's yeast for? And she goes, it makes bread rise, and you're 8 years old, you don't know what that means. That yeast. With a long history of art appreciation and philanthropy, Fleischmann's money would look like genuine patronage. Thomas Braden illuminates how this process works in this quote. We would go to somebody in New York, who was a well-known rich person, and we would say, we want to set up a foundation. We would tell him what we were trying to do and pledge him to secrecy. He would say, of course I'll do it. And then you would publish a letterhead and his name would be on it, and there would be a foundation. It was really a pretty simple device. Critically, and you cannot make this up, several MoMA trustees sit on the board for the Farfield Foundation. And Julian Fleischmann sits on the board for the International Council of the MoMA. The two organizations are completely intertwined. Through this 3-stage funding method, the CIA funnels money to cultural enterprises all over the world. They fund magazines like Encounter in Britain, a literary magazine co-founded by Irving Kristol, the godfather of neoconservatism. Its explicit purpose is to get the left away from Stalinism while still allowing them to be left-wing. Der Monat in Germany, Peruviz in France, Black Orpheus in Nigeria, a pivotal magazine for Nigerian art and literature. Quadrant in Australia, which still publishes to this day. The CCF doesn't care if it's publishing right-wing or left-wing viewpoints, as long as it's anti-communist. In fact, it was very useful for the CIA to fund leftist endeavors, if it meant they could neutralize them away from Stalinism. And on this topic, many of the abstract expressionists are radical leftists. If you can get them to unknowingly walk away from Stalinism while still believing like they're radicals, all the better. This funding of leftist organizations got so out of hand that in 1953, Senator Joseph McCarthy, a man so famous for witch-hunting communists that this period of Congress is eponymously known as McCarthyism, investigated the CIA. They were funding so many leftist publications and organizations, McCarthy assumed the CIA was just actually infiltrated by communists. So they had to get sneakier. This is where the MoMA re-enters the picture, whose former executive secretary is now the head of the IOD, and whose board is intertwined with the Farfield Foundation, starts a brand new program called the International Program. With a grant from the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, Nelson Rockefeller, now chairman of the MoMA, hires his old friend Porter McRae to run the program, someone he worked with at the Office of Inter-American Affairs in the early 1940s. McRae would plan the first international exhibition of American art under the new program, an exhibition called 12 Modern American Painters. The exhibition would tour Paris, Zurich, Dusseldorf, Stockholm, Helsinki, and Oslo, with works from Pollock, Klein, and Philip Guston, all of whom were entirely unaware of the true source of the funding. Funny enough, the exhibition would be curated by a woman named Dorothy C. Miller, who is the wife of a man named Holger Cahill, the fucking director of the Federal Art Project. This first exhibition would be followed by a solo Jackson Pollock exhibition that would tour Japan in 1954. That same year, America would purchase a pavilion at the Venice Biennial, the single most important art exhibition in the world. On the pavilion, they would prominently feature works by de Kooning and Ben Shahn. American abstract expressionism would spread like wildfire, inspiring artists all over Europe and becoming the first art movement that defined the 1950s, all while being astroturfed with money from the CCF and dummy front organizations. Sadly for the schizo and me, and by design, there are very few paper trails between the events. We really only know the architecture behind it. But luckily for us, there is one instance where the CIA got sloppy, and we have direct connection between an exhibition and the CIA. A 1958 exhibition called New American Painting, which featured 81 abstract expressionist works, had been touring around Europe with a final stop in London. When the time came, the Tate Gallery in London couldn't afford to transport the works from their last showing in Paris, and it looked like the final leg of the tour would have to be cancelled. Luckily, Julius Fleischmann Jr. stepped in and from the kindness of his own heart, fronted the cash so the paintings could be moved. This show would go on to attract 15,000 visitors, the highest showing ever for an American art show in Britain. And this money, of course, came directly from the Farfield Foundation. It's now the late 1950s, and the greatest cultural propaganda campaign from America is in full swing. But it's not just visual art. The CIA funds a film adaptation of George Orwell's Animal Farm. They distribute the anti-communist Russian novel Dr. Zhivago all through Eastern Europe. They fund jazz musicians like Dave Brubeck, Dizzy Gillespie, and Louis Armstrong to tour Europe and Latin America. And none of these people know they're part of a CIA operation. And here's truly the fascinating thing. When you picture 1950s America, New York City, jazz, avant-garde art, the hive of Western cultural production, every last part of it was at some point funded by the state. Without the CIA's intervention, we might have never have heard of Jackson Pollock or Mark Rothko. Their paintings wouldn't be sitting front and center in galleries all over the world. And whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, we'll get to that. So how does this all come crashing down? What bombshell went off for the public to denounce abstract expressionism, put Thomas Braden in jail, and for all members of the CCF to face a Nuremberg-style trial? Well, none of that happened. Actually, the whole thing ended with sort of a whimper rather than a bang. Unrelated to actions of the IOD or the CCF, the CIA would start to lose public favor in the 1960s. In January 1961, the first democratically elected leader of the Congo would be assassinated, and a later congressional hearing would prove the CIA's involvement. They would use an unaware Louis Armstrong to play a show celebrating Congolese independence, and the whole thing would be a cover to get access to Congolese leadership. When Armstrong found out, he threatened to renounce his US citizenship altogether. This is followed by the Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961, the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, and the CIA's growing involvement in the burgeoning Vietnam War. By the mid-1960s, the CIA had fully shifted its focus to Southeast Asia, and operations with the IOD were winding down. But by this point, their mission was complete. Abstract expressionism had beat Soviet realism, and New York had become the new center of the art world. So much so that pop art, America's first organic art movement, was taking off globally without any state funding. The success of these operations is evidenced by the fact we are still talking about them today. Works from Rothko de Kooning and Pollock all sit front and center at major galleries all over the world. And by the time the public got any inclination that dark money was used to fund these artists, it was long over. In April 1966, the New York Times ran a 5-part series on the CIA. Article 3, titled Electronic Prying Grows, CIA is Spying from 100 Miles Up, is the first mainstream media piece to reference covert funding operations at dummy fronts. This leads to a congressional investigation by Texas Congressman Wright Patman into tax-exempt foundations. Patman finds evidence of CIA money laundering, but after a meeting with CIA and IRS officials, Patman announces the CIA does not belong in this foundation investigation. He drops this matter probably after realizing just how deep the rabbit hole goes. Then, in February 1967, Ramparts magazine, a West Coast counterculture publication, dropped a bombshell. They published an expose revealing the CIA has been funding the National Student Association for 15 years, and NSA presidents were aware. The CIA controlled the organization's international operations, its magazine, its offices, and its budget. The story is published in the New York Times and Washington Post. It opens the floodgates, and journalists start investigating other CIA-funded organizations. In March 1967, major outlets investigated the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Michael Josselson, CCF's Secretary General since 1950, is confirmed as a CIA officer. He'd been on the CIA payroll the entire time. The CCF funded international art exhibitions of abstract expressionism. The CCF's 17-year reputation is destroyed in weeks. And in lieu of the mounting exposés and evidence stacked against him, Thomas Braden, the old head of the IOD, would break his silence. And in a Saturday Evening Post article released on May 20th, 1967, titled, "I'm glad the CIA is immoral," he would confirm everything. The CCF and all its projects were funded by the CIA. Acts he defended staunchly, saying, "Back in the early 1950s, when the Cold War was really hot, the idea that Congress would have approved many of our projects was about as likely as the John Birch Society's approving of Medicare." That reference has no context for me, but you get the point. He stated that between all the cultural propaganda fronts the Soviets had funded, they had spent about $250 million, about $2.4 billion in 2025 money. And as mentioned before, the IOD had only spent $11 million a year. But regardless of the funding, the efforts were a pragmatic victory. American culture had won. And on the topic of abstract expressionism, Thomas Braden would say, "The extraordinary creativity of abstract expressionism embodied American values." This is precisely why I wanted to make this video. I'm sure everyone has seen a post or a tweet about Jackson Pollock, followed by a comment denouncing it as ugly garbage. I remember PragerU released this video years ago, denouncing abstract expressionism as tasteless, ugly, anti-American garbage. This art movement is so divisive, we still debate about it 70 years later. And that's exactly what makes it so important. The IOD chose to fund it because it was the embodiment of freedom. It was the antithesis to Soviet propaganda. It was something that could only exist in American culture. And I believe the fact the CIA funded it only makes it more authentically American. There's a great irony to the fact that in America, from the very beginning, these artists existed entirely off of state funding First with the Federal Art Project, and then with the CCF and the MoMA. In the country that is supposed to be defined by pulling yourself up by the bootstraps, their most famous art movement was entirely covertly state-funded. That's awesome. That's so fucking interesting. These artists are the reason you think of New York when you think of art. Abstract Expressionism is the American art movement. And if you hate it, you hate America. Luckily, I'm Canadian. Thank you for watching. Never kill yourself. Greetings, everybody. As many of you know, I'm making the switch from Patreon to a new platform called Stacked that just launched. First of all, if you're already a patron and you're worried about what this means for you, it means absolutely nothing. I'll be canceling my Patreon. You'll be getting an email with a link to my Stacked profile. You can sign up. It's the same price. It's the same benefits. Literally nothing's changing. Just a different website. Stacked will also be sending you a discount code for a free month. Still $5 a month minimum, and still all the same benefits. Actually, I'm kind of like partnering with them as an early ambassador of the program, so I'll be posting there a lot more than I was on Patreon. And if you're new, there's a link to my Stacked profile in the description. You can sign up, $5 a month. You get exclusive essays, interviews, private Discord access, book club, name in the credits, and whatever else I feel like posting there. All the tiers do the same thing. It's just all based on how much support you want to give. YouTube takes a lot of work, especially what I do, because I'm writing and researching and editing everything I do. I can post like once a month if I try really hard. And I don't want to post shit. I could post fucking piss on the platform every 4 days and make more money, but I don't want to do that. I want to make fucking Kino. So that kind of monthly support is what really makes what I do possible. Without that, I would fucking be underwater constantly. So, support me on Stacked. Brand new program. I'm really excited to be part of this, be an early adopter, and see where it goes. Thank you for watching. Thank you for all the support, and God bless.